At the family dinner, they called me poor. Then my assistant called. It wasn't the words that stung. It was how casually they said it. Like my worth had already been measured, dismissed, and filed under disappointment. I had parked my 10-year-old Subaru in the circular driveway just past a fleet of glossy black luxury SUVs and one painfully bright lime green sports car. Portland's summer sun was still soft at that hour, and yet everything in that driveway seemed to shimmer with effort. I didn't bother dusting off the pollen on my hood. They wouldn't see the car. They'd only see what it represented in their world failure. My name is Billie Eilish. I'm 31. I live in Portland, Oregon. I run a company most people have never heard of, though their favorite indie musicians probably have. My startup, Auralink, builds AI tools that help small creators protect their work and monetize their catalogs without depending on labels. But that's not what my family sees. To them, I'm the girl who left law school, the girl who wears plain flats and carries a backpack to formal dinners, the girl who once borrowed rent money from her grandma and never asked for help again. Cecilia met me at the front door, arms crossed, tight smile in place. Her hair was freshly blown out, and the Rolex she wore had not one, but 2 diamond bezels. "You made it," she said, pausing to glance behind me. "And you came alone, again." I just nodded and handed her the bottle of wine I'd brought. It was a 2007 Barolo, limited release, aged longer than Brandon's attention span. She barely looked at it before sliding it into a cabinet I knew she used for emergency sauce stock. That bottle would be simmering in marinara before anyone noticed the label. I followed her through the massive kitchen, where our Aunt Evelyn was already sipping something sparkly and murmuring to Brandon about his new content series. He was apparently launching a podcast on luxury mindset. No one asked what I'd been working on. No one ever did. We made our way to the outdoor table overlooking the garden. Every seat had a printed name tag in gold cursive. Mine, of course, had been scribbled in Sharpie. I didn't say anything. As we settled into dinner, the conversation fell into its usual rhythm. Who had closed what deal? Which cousin got approved for which elite credit card? And how Evelyn's daughter had just bought a second condo in Miami. Brandon took a bite of seared tuna and, without looking at me, said, "Billie, do you still do that digital thing?" I replied. "Still do." "Yes," he laughed, turning to Cecilia. "Hey, at least she's consistent." I let the comment slide, as I always did. The silence after his laugh was louder than the insult. Even Grandma Eleanor, seated at the far end, looked uncomfortable. Cecilia leaned forward. "You know, if you ever want to learn how to build something sustainable, I could show you how we scaled the accessories line this year. We're in Neiman's now." Her voice was all sugar, but the implication burned. I looked around the table, noting how everyone's outfits looked editorial ready. Even Evelyn's cocktail ring probably had its own insurance policy. My thrifted linen dress suddenly felt like sandpaper. They weren't trying to be cruel. I told myself this was just how they communicated status first, substance later. I had chosen a different path, and they had chosen to forget it existed. The salad course came and went, followed by cedar plank salmon and a round of champagne to celebrate Brandon's newest 6-figure brand deal. Nobody toasted me, but I didn't need them to. I had closed a licensing deal last week with an AI security firm for 7 times what Brandon's contract was worth. My assistant Jules had already wired the funds to our expansion budget. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, until my phone buzzed. At first, I considered ignoring it. Family dinner was sacred. After all, sacred in the way a gladiator match was sacred. But when I saw Jules's name on the screen, I quietly excused myself from the table. "Work call," I said. Cecilia snorted. So mysterious. I stepped inside, just past the glass doors, and picked up. "Everything all right?" I asked. Knowing Jules would never call unless it was urgent, her voice was crisp, low, focused. "The team in Berlin just sent over the final contract. We'll need your sign-off tonight if we want to announce the acquisition tomorrow." I glanced outside. They were still laughing about something. "Okay," I said. "Send it to my secure inbox. Anything else?" She paused. "Also, Spotify confirmed the keynote slot. You'll be speaking after the CEO. Press wants your response by morning." I nodded slowly. "I'll draft something before midnight." Behind me, I felt a chill not in the air, but in the eyes I knew were watching from the window. They had no idea who I'd become, but they were about to. When I stepped back outside, I didn't need to say anything. My phone still glowed in my hand, and that alone was enough to pull every eye back to me. Brandon was mid-story about a sponsored trip to Monaco when he trailed off. Sensing the shift in tone, my mother's cousin leaned over and whispered something about tech startups always being so intense. Cecilia raised one eyebrow and asked with mock interest, "Everything okay at your digital boutique?" I gave a small nod and took my seat. The assumption, as always, was that I was still clinging to some unstable side project, barely staying afloat while they thrived, and I let them believe that, let them enjoy their dinner. They didn't know that I once sat at a different table, not too long ago, when I had no company, no contracts, no team, and barely enough rent money to keep the lights on in my one-bedroom walk-up. The truth was, 5 years ago, I had been laid off, not just quietly released, but humiliated. Mr. Laird, the CEO of the firm I worked for, made it a public display. "Your creativity is admirable." "Billy," he said in front of a room full of VPs, "but we need people who can follow systems, not challenge them." I was let go 2 weeks before Christmas, with nothing but a severance packet and a tight-lipped HR escort. I'd spent 3 years working 12-hour days for that company, thinking if I kept my head down and over-delivered, eventually someone would reward me. They didn't. I remember walking home that day, Portland skies drizzling just enough to blur my vision without providing cover. I didn't cry. Not that day. I was too stunned to process the weight of what had just happened. The crying came later, when I called Grandma Eleanor and tried to tell her what I'd done wrong. She didn't say much. Just told me to come over and eat. That stew was on the stove, and I could figure everything else out afterward. That dinner probably saved me more than I knew. In the weeks that followed, I applied to 47 jobs. No one called. I considered temp work, going back to school, even joining Cecilia's PR firm just to shut everyone up. I almost said yes when Evelyn offered me a starter role at her interior design company, which really just meant being her unpaid assistant. Instead, I said no and sat on my living room floor for 2 weeks straight, sketching an idea I'd once buried. Auralink wasn't even called that back then. It was just Project SafeTune in my notebook, a vague idea about using machine learning to detect unauthorized music use online and help small artists get paid fairly. I didn't know how to build it yet, or who would care, but it felt like something real, something that didn't require a business card or a borrowed reputation to exist. I used the last $3,000 I had to buy a refurbished laptop, a few basic cloud computing tools, and access to a developer community, my social life evaporated. My credit card balance bloomed. I stopped answering family messages because every time they asked how I was, the answer was too long and too complicated to explain, and frankly, none of them really wanted to hear it. The first 6 months were brutal. I got scammed by a freelancer who promised to build my beta and ghosted me after I paid. I accidentally crashed my own prototype while trying to connect it to a basic front end. There were nights I skipped meals because every dollar needed to go toward a server subscription or a license. Ray, the guy I'd been dating for 2 years by then, suggested maybe I put the project on pause and get a stable job again. I knew he meant well, but he left 3 weeks later anyway. Said he needed someone more balanced. I didn't argue. I just nodded. By the end of that year, I had 2 part-time jobs and a half-working prototype, and I was still in it. What kept me going was the small stuff. The unsigned artist from Atlanta who emailed to say she used my code snippet and finally got YouTube to take down a stolen beat. The indie band from Chicago that said they tracked down a licensing violation thanks to one of my free trial alerts. They didn't pay me. They didn't owe me. But they reminded me why I started. Eventually, someone else noticed. A venture partner at a low-profile fund messaged me out of nowhere, said his daughter used my tracker and showed him my dashboard. We talked, then we negotiated, then we signed. Auralink became real the day that wire transfer hit. It wasn't big money by tech standards, but it was enough to hire 2 engineers, register the LLC, and build a real beta. That was the day I walked into Cecilia's apartment for a birthday party, and she told me I looked tired and should really consider getting back into something respectable. I just smiled. The thing is, I never needed them to believe in me. I only needed them to stop being so sure I had failed. They hadn't seen the nights I worked through server outages, the meetings I took in borrowed clothes, the early investor rejections that came with patronizing notes. They didn't know that I'd once walked into an accelerator pitch room and been asked if I was the assistant, not the founder. They didn't know how often I was underestimated. Or maybe they did, and they liked it that way. But something had changed since then. I had changed, and this dinner, this familiar theater of comparison and casual cruelty, was about to play out differently than it ever had before. After that first funding round, things didn't magically become easier. There were no champagne toasts or dramatic office unveilings. Just more work, more decisions, more risk. Auralink had its name now, and that name started to appear in the margins of conversations inside obscure music law forums, private Discord servers for artists, and underground tech blogs. I didn't hire a PR team. I didn't buy ads. I focused on building something that worked. For 6 months, I lived like a ghost, coming home after midnight, forgetting to water my plants, and sometimes sleeping with my laptop still warm on the sheets beside me. The apartment shrank as the project grew. The coffee table became a desk, and the bedroom a 24-hour war room of sticky notes, error logs, and hastily sketched roadmap diagrams. I lost weight without trying, not because I wanted to, but because I kept forgetting to eat. Every milestone came with new pressure. With every new client, I had to fight off self-doubt. Every month brought a new round of decisions that could kill everything if I made the wrong one. Hiring the wrong engineer, signing with the wrong partner, or worse, moving too fast. There was a week when our server went down, and we lost all tracking data from 5 major clients. I stared at the blank analytics board in shock, knowing that one of our pilots was scheduled to present those metrics to their investors in 36 hours. Jules stayed with me that entire weekend. surviving on vending machine snacks and lukewarm coffee while we rebuilt the infrastructure from scratch. She never asked for extra pay. She didn't need praise. She simply believed in the thing we were building, even when I wasn't sure I did. That's when I knew I'd found the right people. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, just the kind that showed up when it counted. And in that way, they became my real family. Meanwhile, the family I was born into remained a distant echo. Occasionally, my mother would text links to job postings at companies she thought were more suitable. Sometimes Cecilia would tag me on LinkedIn under comments about pivoting with Grace. I never responded. I didn't have the energy to explain that I wasn't lost, or flailing, or chasing a dream. I was building infrastructure for creators the way banks once built vaults for money. It just looked different, less marble, more code, less prestige, more purpose. But explaining that to them felt like trying to describe color to someone who insisted the world was grayscale. So I stopped trying. Ray reappeared briefly, about a year into the company's public beta. He asked to catch up and brought 2 flat whites from my favorite shop, the one he never liked. He said he'd been reading about Auralink and wanted to apologize for not seeing it sooner. I listened politely. Then I asked if he wanted a tour of the office. He said yes. It wasn't much at the time, just a sublet space with shared walls and scuffed floors. But I could see his expression shift when he met the team. I could see it when he looked at the whiteboard full of metrics and milestones. He asked if I was dating anyone. I said I was too busy. That was true. But also, I no longer needed validation from someone who'd once left because I dreamed too loud. Ray said he was happy for me. I nodded and walked him out. A month later, one of our competitor platforms, Maxonic, issued a DMCA takedown notice against one of our features. They accused us of stealing their approach to audio fingerprinting. The accusation was nonsense, but it caused enough noise to rattle some of our clients. Our funding pipeline slowed. A few artists paused their subscriptions, and one of our angel investors started asking pointed questions. I stayed calm in meetings, answered every concern with data, and spent sleepless nights going through legal strategy documents with outside counsel. Cecilia posted a status that week that read, "Sometimes people just need to admit when they're in over their heads." I didn't comment. We survived the attack, barely, but it left scars. I couldn't eat without feeling acid creep into my throat. I lost 3 engineers to burnout. Jules and I sat in silence one Friday night after clearing our inboxes, staring at the blinking cursor of our revenue dashboard. We were breaking even, but just barely. I looked at her and said, "Maybe I should sell it." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "You didn't come this far to build something sellable. You came this far because you're the only one who knows what this is really worth." That sentence stayed with me. It was the exact opposite of everything I'd ever heard from my family. They measured worth in handbags, vacation clubs, and the size of the brand name on your check. Jules measured it in what you were building, who it helped, and whether it would still mean something when you weren't in the room. That weekend, I turned down an acquisition offer from a VC firm that wanted to fold Auralink into their portfolio. I knew I couldn't hand this off to someone who would gut it for a quick return. I'd rather go down with it than let it be hollowed out. That decision cost me sleep, comfort, and certainty. But it gave me back something else, my voice. By the time we signed the deal in Berlin that Jules had just called me about, Auralink had quietly passed a $500 million valuation. We didn't announce it. We didn't throw a party. We just did what we always did. We went back to work, back at the dinner table. The conversation had shifted from finance to travel. Cecilia was recounting her third trip to Santorini this year, her voice syrupy with rehearsed wonder as she described the villa's infinity pool. Evelyn chimed in with a story about a fashion gala in Milan, pretending not to name-drop designers she'd barely met. Brandon scrolled through photos on his phone, angling the screen just enough to show off private jet interiors while pretending to be modest. I sat there quietly, nodding when appropriate, swirling water in my glass as though it were something stronger. My plate remained half full. No one noticed. Cecilia turned to me with the same tone she once used when I failed a spelling test in 4th grade. "So, Billy, any plans to finally upgrade your car? That Subaru looks like it belongs in a museum." The laughter that followed was quick and sharp, like a rehearsed sitcom cue. I smiled. "I've actually gotten kind of attached to it. It's reliable." Brandon raised his eyebrows. "That's not really the word people aim for when describing their lifestyle." I shrugged. "I guess I'm not aiming for what most people are." That silenced them for a second, but only long enough for Evelyn to lean forward. "Be honest. Darling, isn't it exhausting pretending you don't want more?" I thought about that question longer than they expected, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I knew the version they wanted. They wanted to hear that I'd made peace with failure, that I'd stopped chasing relevance, that I'd found contentment in mediocrity. That would have made them comfortable. But the truth was, I wanted plenty. I wanted better systems, better access, a seat at the table where rules were made, not enforced. I just didn't want it their way. I didn't want to chase shine. I wanted to build substance. So I answered carefully, wanting more isn't a weakness. It just depends on what more means to you. That annoyed Cecilia. Her smile twitched. She picked up her wine glass and said, "Well, if you ever want to try a real lifestyle, let me know. We have a few entry-level roles opening up at the firm. You could learn a lot." The tone was sugar, but the offer was a slap. I nodded. "Appreciate it. I'll keep that in mind." They didn't know that by entry level. She meant serving as her assistant while she barked demands and took credit for ideas others pitched. She'd done it before. I'd seen her break a junior exec to tears in a dressing room because her assistant forgot to steam a blouse before a press shoot. That job offer wasn't about helping me. It was about reminding me where she believed I belonged. My grandmother, seated at the end of the table in her pale blue cardigan, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. "Billy's always done things differently. That doesn't mean she's wrong." The table fell quiet for a beat, unsure how to respond. No one dared contradict Grandma Eleanor directly, not because of age or respect, but because deep down they all knew she saw through them. She'd grown up through war and ration books, and she had no patience for showmanship dressed as success. Cecilia recovered first. "Of course. Grandma, we're just worried. Billy's so private these days." I raised my glass slightly. "Privacy is underrated." Brandon laughed. "Come on, Billy. You're telling us you're not even dating anyone. We can't all be married to our laptops." I considered correcting him, telling them about Ray, about how we'd reconnected quietly and carefully, this time as equals. But I didn't owe them that. They'd mocked me enough when he left the first time. Instead, I replied, "I'm married to building something that outlasts me. Everything else comes second right now." Evelyn scoffed. "That's not sustainable. You'll burn out before you get anywhere worth going." Jules texted again. I glanced at the screen. A short message, "Press embargo lifted. They're starting to run it." I looked back up at my family. still locked in their circular dance of superficial status updates and casual cruelty. They hadn't yet noticed the storm building outside their bubble, but the air had shifted. I could feel it. Before anyone else could interject, Cecilia pulled out her phone and scanned a headline. I caught the logo. It was Tech Week. Her eyes narrowed. "Billy," she said slowly. "Is this you?" She turned the screen around. The headline was bold and clean. Portland-based Auralink acquires European audio platform in landmark deal. The article photo was of me, speaking at a panel months ago. I'd worn the same linen dress I had on tonight. Brandon blinked. "Wait, Auralink is you?" I nodded. "Yeah, that's what I've been building." There was a pause, the first real silence since dinner began. And in that silence, I watched the first crack form in the story they had built about me, the one where I was the underachiever, the cautionary tale, the girl who didn't make it. They were realizing that while they were performing success, I had been building it quietly, consistently, without asking for permission. Cecilia lowered her phone slowly, her manicured fingers still gripping the edges tighter than necessary. The silence that followed was thick, suspended somewhere between disbelief and panic. Evelyn blinked first. "Well," she said, attempting to reclaim control of the room, "it's wonderful that you've kept yourself busy, but acquisitions can be tricky. Hopefully, you have good legal support." I could see the effort it took for her to sound condescending while realizing I just closed a deal that made her real estate portfolio look like a weekend craft project. Brandon leaned across the table, his face equal parts curiosity and calculation. "Wait, so you own the company?" "Like." The whole thing. I met his eyes. "I'm the founder and CEO. We're private but fully held by our core team and early investors. I control majority equity." He tried to laugh, but it came out uneven. "So you've been sitting on this the whole time. You've let us think," I interrupted softly. "Let you think what you wanted to think. I never corrected you. That stung more than anything. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true." They'd crafted their assumptions with such conviction that my silence became complicity. I watched as the gears turned behind Cecilia's eyes, cycling through memories of every dismissive remark, every patronizing suggestion, every time she offered me old clothes in the name of sisterly support. She swallowed hard. "So the dinner invitation, was that a setup?" I shook my head. "No, it was a courtesy. I showed up out of respect, not strategy." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. My phone buzzed again. Jules, one-line CNN Business, just picked it up. I didn't respond. The moment had already shifted. My father, who had been unusually quiet the entire evening, finally set down his fork. "Billy," he said in his measured tone, "perhaps this is an opportunity for us to reconnect. Now that your work has reached a new level, there are things we could explore together." That was classic him. Wait for validation, then claim involvement. He hadn't mentioned my name at his last industry conference. I know because a colleague told me. He'd introduced himself as father of two Cecilia in fashion, Brandon in digital content. No mention of me. I looked at him evenly. "You once told me I was embarrassing the family brand by not taking the Morgan Stanley offer. You said I was making a scene by starting something no one had heard of." He shifted in his chair. "That was years ago. We all say things we regret." I let the word settle. Except I didn't regret it. I regretted thinking your opinion mattered more than my own instincts. Evelyn stood abruptly and began gathering plates, the only sign she knew she'd lost control of the room. Brandon cleared his throat. "I mean, obviously, this changes a few things. There might be synergy between what we're building And I cut in, just a little too fast. We're not looking for new partners. Cecilia's eyes snapped back to mine. You're serious, I nodded. Very. Across the table. Grandma Eleanor was smiling into her teacup, saying nothing. But I knew she'd been waiting for this moment longer than I had. She once told me that some people need to see you shine from far away because they never deserved a front row seat. That night, her words echoed louder than ever. I reached into my bag, pulled out a slim envelope, and slid it across to Cecilia. You'll want to see this. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was a press invite, not to a party or launch event, but to our IPO pre-announcement next quarter. The card was matte black, simple text, nothing performative, just the logo and one line. You're invited because you missed everything else. Her jaw tightened. You think this makes up for it? I tilted my head. It was never about making up for anything. It's just a courtesy reminder of what you once called unrealistic. Evelyn returned with dessert, though no one seemed hungry anymore. My father shifted into business mode. We could introduce you to our family office team, help with the transition into public markets. We've been through this before. I nodded slowly. I'm sure you have. But I've already built the team I trust. We don't need outside help. Brandon opened his phone, typing rapidly, probably trying to Google valuation estimates or DM my head of growth. He didn't know she already had him muted. It was starting to unravel for them now, not just the assumptions, but the certainty that they were the center of the family, of the narrative, of control. The more they tried to regain composure, the more it slipped through their fingers. And I didn't have to raise my voice or deliver some grand monologue. All I had to do was exist, fully. In the truth I had built brick by brick. Cecilia pushed her chair back, her voice a forced whisper. So you've just been sitting there watching us. All these years I met her eyes. No, I've been building something you never bothered to look at. That's not on me. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow-motion domino fall. Each member of my family processed the truth at their own pace. But the shift in tone was unmistakable. Just hours earlier, they had barely looked in my direction except to mock or minimize. Now they were calculating every word before speaking, scanning my face for cues, wondering how much more I'd kept hidden. But the irony was I hadn't hidden anything, they just never asked. Brandon, always the fastest to pivot, leaned back with a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Billy, I've actually been meaning to talk to you about this new content platform I'm developing. It's all about empowering creatives. Maybe there's a crossover play. I took a sip of water before responding. Sounds interesting. If you'd like to submit a pitch. Our business development team has an intake form online. His face flickered. Right, of course. Just thought we could shortcut that since. You know, we're family. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The silence did it for me. Cecilia kept scanning her phone, probably trying to understand the scope of what she'd missed. Her pride was thick, but so was her fear of irrelevance. That combination makes people reckless. She finally looked up. Are you hiring? The room went still again. I raised one eyebrow. For what? Her voice tightened. Something strategic. I've led brand growth across 2 continents. You know that. I nodded. I do. But we have a different approach at Auralink. Our hires go through a blind process. Portfolio first. Keeps it fair. She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. Right, fair. I knew she'd never make it past our culture interview. My father had moved into damage control mode, a talent he'd perfected over decades of boardrooms and deals that hinged on charm more than clarity. You know, Billy, I've always said your tenacity would take you far. Clearly, I was right. He chuckled softly, hoping we could all pretend the past hadn't happened. And your mother and I, well, we're just so proud of what you've built. I met his gaze with calm precision. You called my business an embarrassment. You told me to shut it down before I embarrassed the family further. That wasn't tenacity you saw. It was dismissal. He leaned back, adjusting his cuffs. People say things. It was a different time. I smiled. Time doesn't erase impact. It just reveals who meant what they said. Even Evelyn, the matriarch of polished judgment and passive scorn, attempted a pivot. I always believed in you. Darling, you were just so unconventional. I didn't know how to support you. I tilted my head slightly. Support isn't complicated. It's just showing up without expecting control. She didn't have a response for that. Grandma Eleanor sat quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Then, softly, she said, "You don't owe them explanations, but you've given them grace anyway. That's power." Her words settled over the table like a benediction. For a moment, no one moved. Then dessert arrived, untouched. The dishes clinked like punctuation on a sentence that no longer made sense. Brandon excused himself to take a call, which really meant escape the awkwardness. Cecilia's husband stared down at his lap, pretending to check emails. Evelyn began stacking plates that didn't belong to her, anything to look busy. The illusion had cracked, and they didn't know how to exist outside of it. I stood up slowly. "Thank you for dinner." My father also stood, as if protocol still mattered. "Are you heading out?" We were hoping to talk more. I nodded. "I'm flying to Stockholm in the morning, meeting with our partners on digital licensing." Brandon reappeared just in time to say, "Private or commercial?" I smiled. "Chartered. We fly carbon offset for team travel. It's built into our ops model." His jaw tightened. Cecilia tried once more. "I'm sure we could find a way to collaborate. You know, now that you're in the right rooms." I looked at her evenly. I built the room. Outside. The night was cool and quiet. My car, the old Subaru they all mocked, waited patiently near the edge of the lot. I slid into the driver's seat, not in spite of the car's simplicity, but because of it. It was my reminder that value doesn't always look like shine. As I pulled out, I caught a glimpse of Evelyn through the dining room window, peeking through the curtain like she'd forgotten how to look curious without appearing threatened. My phone buzzed once. A message from Jules. "Your schedule's been updated. Press wants you live for the IPO special next week." "We good to confirm," I texted back. "Confirm. Then take tomorrow off. You've earned it." In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it disappeared behind a curve. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of proving anything. Not to them, not to anyone. I had already done what mattered. Quietly, effectively, without applause. The first message came before I even reached the freeway ramp. Cecilia's name lit up on the dashboard screen with a chirpy notification. "Let's do coffee this week. I want to hear more about your vision. We're so proud of you." I didn't answer. By the time I pulled into the underground lot of my apartment building, there were 2 more messages. One from Brandon. Subject line all caps, "Sick idea for a collab." The second, from my father, simply read, "Dinner next week, just the 2 of us." I stared at the screen, then turned it off. Silence felt cleaner. In the days that followed, the outreach multiplied. My mother sent a handwritten card that arrived on thick embossed stationery she likely reserved for gala invitations. She wrote about how families go through phases and how she missed the closeness we used to have. There was no mention of the years she openly compared me to Cecilia at every birthday party, or how she told a dinner guest once that I was just figuring things out. Brandon emailed again, this time with a slide deck attached. He'd mocked me for years for trying to be Steve Jobs with no budget, but now suddenly wanted to launch a podcast network focused on ethical creator growth. The pitch was weak, filled with buzzwords and recycled frameworks, but the desperation was loud between the lines. Cecilia sent a package. Inside was a framed photo of us from childhood, taken during a summer camping trip where I'd fallen into a river and she'd insisted I ruined her shoes. On the back, she had written, "You've always been stronger than people realized. Let's reconnect. Life's too short." I set the frame on the shelf, face down. There was nothing cruel in the gesture. It just didn't change anything. A memory doesn't undo years of erasure. Then came the article, a glowing profile in a national business magazine, calling Auralink the quiet storm behind the creator rights movement. They mentioned our revenue growth, our IP partnerships, and our technology's impact on thousands of small musicians. My face was on the cover. I wore the same linen dress, again. The article mentioned I drove a Subaru and lived in a modest apartment by choice. The internet ran with it. The anti-hype CEO, minimalist billionaire. The headlines didn't bother me. I hadn't built this for a headline. What did bother me, at first, was how quickly people began rewriting the past. I heard through a colleague that Evelyn had joined a young entrepreneur mentorship board and introduced herself as a proud aunt of the Auralink founder. Cecilia was photographed at a networking event referencing her sister's pioneering tech work. Brandon updated his LinkedIn bio to include family legacy rooted in digital innovation. None of them had asked. None of them had apologized. They simply repositioned themselves in the story once they realized it was valuable. The temptation to call them out, to correct the record, did come, more than once, but I didn't. Not because I was above it, but because it wasn't necessary. The people who mattered knew the truth. The team that had worked late nights without asking for recognition. The developers who'd taken a chance on a company no one could pronounce. The artists who finally got paid because our tools traced a stolen riff to the exact timestamp. Those people knew. They didn't need a press kit. Jules reminded me of that when I forwarded her yet another family message. She replied simply, "Legacy isn't what people say about you. It's what keeps working when you're not in the room." She was right, so instead of replying to the messages, I forwarded them all to a filter she had built, tagging them non-essential family and routing them to a folder I never opened. Cecilia sent one last message 2 weeks later. It was shorter than the others. I lost my role at the firm, restructuring. Just wanted to say I admire what you've done. Let me know if there's ever an opening. I read it twice. There was no gloating in me, just a quiet ache, not for her, but for the years wasted in performance instead of presence. I didn't reply. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive, but I wasn't naive either. I had built boundaries as carefully as I built code, and I didn't have room for people who only respected results, not the resilience behind them. I had once believed that success might earn me a seat at their table. Now I knew I didn't need their table. I had built my own. And it was sturdy. It held people who showed up when there was no spotlight, people who believed in the work before the world noticed. That was the family I chose. That was the foundation I trusted. Everything else was just noise. As the headlines quieted and the buzz began to fade into the usual digital hum, I returned to the one place that had never betrayed me the work. The meetings didn't slow down. If anything, they grew sharper. We were planning a global rollout of our new audio tracking engine, with pilots in Tokyo, Nairobi, and Sao Paulo. The legal team was finalizing licensing agreements that would shift how metadata was handled across platforms. We weren't chasing press anymore. We were changing the infrastructure, quietly, again, precisely how I liked it. I spent most of my mornings reviewing user feedback, deep in the back-end logs of artists using our platform in real time. I watched a singer in Lagos win a dispute against a European ad agency that had lifted her chorus. I watched a music producer in Brooklyn finally receive payment for a jingle used in a regional fast food chain. These were small victories to the world, but they were oxygen to me. Proof that the years of obscurity hadn't been for nothing. Proof that the purpose was still pure. Ray came by on Sundays sometimes. He didn't ask about the IPO. He asked if I'd eaten, if I'd slept. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, just sat on the rooftop of my apartment building with laptops open and playlists blending together. He still ran his own company, and we still gave each other space. I'd learned that relationships didn't need to be loud to be real. The quiet ones, the steady ones, often held the deepest weight. Jules finally took her vacation. After 3 years of canceled plans and overnight flights, she sent me a photo of her reading a paperback novel on a beach in Greece. I smiled when I saw it. I wired her a bonus the next morning and didn't say a word about it. She texted me a week later, "I'm finally learning to do nothing. And it's glorious." That felt like a win, too. Cecilia didn't follow up after her last message. Brandon posted a vague story about people not appreciating collaborative energy, and then pivoted to promoting a new crypto-adjacent media app. Evelyn rebranded herself as a mentor to underestimated founders, though she never mentioned our last family dinner. My father kept sending news clippings of businesses he thought I should consider acquiring. I archived them all. My mother's texts became increasingly sentimental, full of memories that had nothing to do with me, as if rewriting the past could soften the truth. But I didn't feel cold toward them, just distant, like watching actors I once knew perform a version of a story that no longer required my participation. There was no anger left, no hunger to correct them. I had already won, not because they lost, but because I had built something lasting in a world that celebrates flash and forgets substance. I had chosen the long way, the harder way, and it had shaped me into someone who no longer needed recognition to feel rooted. One morning, I walked into the office and saw a new intern staring at my car in the lot. She looked confused. I asked if she was okay, and she hesitated before asking, "Is that really yours?" I nodded. "It gets me where I need to go." She smiled awkwardly and said she thought someone like me would drive something. Well, different. I just nodded again. Most of what matters can't be seen from the outside. That afternoon, I gave a talk to a room full of developers and small creators. No media, no press, just real people with real questions. I told them the truth, that building something you believe in will almost always look like failure from the outside, that being overlooked is often the best place to begin, that not everyone deserves a seat in your audience, especially if they spent years trying to mute your voice. I didn't say those last lines out loud, but I felt them settle into the silence after I spoke. Later that week, I received an invitation to a charity event hosted by Evelyn. The card was thick and expensive. My name was printed in embossed silver. Billie Eilish, visionary entrepreneur. Below it, a note in cursive script. You've made us all so proud. I closed the envelope and placed it on my shelf next to the other unopened letters. I had no intention of attending. I had already learned what they hadn't. You don't need to be celebrated by the people who once doubted you. You just need to live in a way that makes their old assumptions irrelevant. That's not revenge. That's alignment. And it's quieter than you think. There was a time when I thought proving myself meant being louder, showing up shinier, giving people the exact version of success they respected. I used to imagine walking into a family gathering in a designer suit, stepping out of something sleek and European, announcing my wins like headlines at a press conference. But when that moment finally came, it didn't look like that. It looked like linen and silence. It sounded like restraint and clarity, and it felt like freedom, not victory. Somewhere along the way, I stopped chasing their recognition and started choosing my own alignment. At first, it was lonely, leaving behind familiar structures, even toxic ones. Always is, but over time, I built something else, a different type of family, not based on blood, but on belief, not inherited, but earned. My team didn't care what car I drove. They cared about whether we shipped the right update, whether the user experience was accessible, whether we were delivering real value instead of just metrics. That became the new standard. That became the only thing that mattered. Cecilia once told me that people like us don't get second chances. She meant well. She thought she was warning me that the world doesn't forgive mistakes. But what I've learned is that the world actually forgets a lot faster than it forgives. And that's a good thing, because while they were busy forgetting the version of me they'd reduced to a footnote, I was writing the next chapters, quietly, deliberately, without bitterness, just momentum. When we launched our Creator Justice Index, a real-time transparency tool that let artists see how their audio was being used globally, we didn't get a standing ovation. We got a flood of emails. Artists from rural schools, refugee camps, and small-town open mics. They weren't asking for exposure. They were asking for dignity. I printed some of those emails and framed them, not for others to see, but so I wouldn't forget why I started. I had once thought my revenge would be being undeniable, but real peace came from being unavailable to their narrative entirely. That month, I went back to that same restaurant where Cecilia once told me I looked tired and unpolished. This time, I sat at a different table, not hidden in the corner like before, but in plain view. I wore the same black flats and my usual coat. Nothing branded, nothing loud. The hostess didn't flinch. She greeted me by name. The owner came out and thanked me personally for helping his niece secure licensing rights for her original music. None of it was performative. It was just full circle. The press kept calling. They wanted follow-ups, exclusives, cover shoots. I turned most of them down, not because I was hiding, but because the work still spoke loudest when I stayed quiet. I agreed to one interview, a podcast hosted by an old friend from college who had also taken the long road. We talked about what it means to succeed on your own terms. She asked if I had advice for people whose families still didn't see their worth. I paused before answering. Then I said, "You don't need to be visible to them to be valuable to the world. Some people won't understand until the evidence breaks through their comfort. And even then, it's not your job to teach them. It's your job to keep building." When I left the studio, I sat in the car for a long time. No music, no notifications. just the sound of Portland rain tapping on the windshield. I thought about all the versions of myself I had to outgrow. The one who waited for permission, the one who over-explained, the one who softened herself so no one else felt small. They all got me this far, but they didn't get to stay. The family kept trying in small ways, invitations, updates, subtle mentions of how proud we are in front of strangers. I never told them to stop. I just stopped responding. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks you control. I chose peace, not access, and that made all the difference. In our new office, the hallway leading to the team room has a framed quote on the wall. It's not from a business leader or public figure. It's from one of our earliest users. A handwritten line that says, "I didn't think anyone would fight for someone like me." Every time I pass it, I remember that's what real success feels like. Not applause, not validation, but impact. Quiet, permanent, unmistakable. 1 year later, almost to the day, another family dinner invite appeared in my inbox. This time, it wasn't a group text or some passive-aggressive email from Evelyn. It was a formal card, delivered in a cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax, embossed with the Thompson crest like it was a royal summons. The note inside read simply, "We'd love to have you join us this year. No pressure, just presence. Warmly, Cecilia." There was no agenda, no veiled insult, no sales pitch wrapped in pleasantries, just an empty chair waiting. I sat with it for a moment. I turned it over in my hands. Then I put it on the counter beside the empty wine bottle I'd been saving for something else entirely. That Saturday, I didn't dress for them. I dressed for me. Same flats. A soft blouse I'd bought on a whim from a small artist-owned shop in Copenhagen. My hair pulled back simply. No jewelry, but the quiet gold ring Ray gave me when he said he didn't want to be louder than my mission, just aligned with it. The car was still the same, my Subaru with the one chipped handle and the scar across the bumper from that icy parking lot in 2018. It started without protest, always did. When I pulled up, I saw the familiar fleet in the driveway, newer models now, Cecilia's Bentley, Brandon's leased sports car, Evelyn's polished SUV, but none of them felt taller than me anymore. I walked to the front door and paused for a breath. The air was cooler than I remembered. But maybe that was just me finally breathing fully. Inside. The table looked the same, long, ornate, too wide for real conversation. But they had changed one thing. My name card was printed this time, not scribbled in Sharpie, and it was placed directly across from Cecilia's seat, center, not at the end like before. They greeted me gently, not too warm, not too scripted, like people trying to figure out how to start over without admitting they'd erased you. I took my seat quietly, listened as Evelyn told a story about volunteering at a startup boot camp, listened as Brandon talked about his newest venture, this time not in crypto, but in slow media or something equally vague. My father nodded along. My mother said I looked well-rested, which I took as her attempt at praise. They didn't ask questions about the company, and I didn't offer updates. We just sat, ate, observed, until dessert. When my grandmother, who had grown quieter in recent months, reached out and touched my hand gently. "You always had it in you. They just needed to catch up." I didn't reply. I just nodded, grateful someone had always known. As the plates were cleared, Cecilia raised her glass. "To Billy," she said, eyes clearer than I'd seen them in years. for showing us that quiet work still shakes the world. The room joined in, not with thunder, but with something close to sincerity. I didn't drink. I just looked at them. This family that had once mistaken silence for failure, that had mistaken humility for insignificance. They weren't villains. They were just conditioned to believe that loudness equaled legitimacy. And maybe now, they were starting to unlearn that. After dinner, I stepped outside for air. The sky had turned a kind of gold that only late spring in Portland delivers, soft and honest. Jules texted me with tomorrow's flight confirmation, Stockholm again, this time, for the launch of our global education platform for creators in underrepresented regions. I typed back, pack light, let's make it clean and fast. She sent back a thumbs up, then a heart. Cecilia stepped out a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea. I didn't spike it, she said, half joking. I accepted it anyway. She sat beside me on the step, the same one where she once told me I was wasting my potential by not playing the family game. You were always 5 moves ahead. She said quietly, I just didn't know how to see it. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Some things land better in silence. When I finally drove away, no one followed. No one chased my car into the driveway. No desperate calls. No backhanded remarks. Just quiet. The kind that comes after a storm when the ground is still wet, but the clouds have passed. I drove home slowly, passing by the same corners where I once questioned everything, the same streetlights that watched me walk home jobless and humiliated, the same gas station where I once calculated whether I had enough to fill a half tank and still afford groceries. They were still there, but I wasn't. Back at the apartment, I sat on the couch and opened my laptop. The press embargo had lifted. Our latest tech partnership had gone public. My inbox was full again, but I didn't rush to respond. I leaned back, looked at the ceiling, and just let the quiet settle. Sometimes. The best revenge isn't proving anyone wrong. It's building a life where their opinions never dictated your direction to begin with. It's in the stillness, in the clarity, in the way you choose your voice, even when no one's listening. And maybe the question now isn't whether they'll understand you. Maybe it's this. When they finally stop laughing, will you still need them to